Hey, welcome back to the book of Daniel. We are in chapter 8 today as we continue now looking at the visions that Daniel himself has. And we see consistently in these an interesting theme that Daniel is now the one needing an interpreter. Prior to this, he had been interpreting dreams and visions. God had given him the ability to interpret and see things. And now we see Daniel is the one in need. And so now we're in Daniel chapter 8, and he starts off this vision. This is, by the way, during the reign of King Belshazzar, and just a couple of years after the first vision that he had. And in this one, he finds himself at a canal, and he says he sees a ram. And this ram is described as having these two horns. And he says these are very large, high extending horns. One is a little bit higher than the other, it says. And it goes around. It says he goes from the west to the north to the south, and it's devastating everything, and nothing can withstand this ram. And then we see another creature enter in. It's a goat. And this goat, it says, has a very prominent horn in the middle of its forehead. It extends back just one horn, but this one horn is very, very prominent. And the goat, it says, is enraged against this ram. And this goat takes on this ram and it crushes it. It knocks off its horns and then it tramples it underfoot and destroys it. And so after this one horn is then, once the goat, then it says, becomes great and powerful, all of a sudden this one horn, it falls off and four other horns replace it. And then there's another smaller horn that comes up, and a description of that horn follows in Daniel's vision. So Daniel has this vision and is kind of wondering, what does it mean? What is going on in this vision? Daniel, the interpreter of dreams, is perplexed by his dream. And so he is sent the angel Gabriel. The angel Gabriel comes to Daniel. It says to interpret the dream. We see that in Daniel chapter 8, verse 15 and 16, that Gabriel comes to interpret for him. And Gabriel tells him that this vision that he has is for the time of the end, the time of the end. So there is something significant about this vision that is talking to us and speaking to us about the end. And then Gabriel then starts to describe things about the vision. And we find out that we're not talking that every element of this vision is not necessarily about the end of time when Christ will come back and return, because he very specifically identifies this ram and the goat. And we see these things in history, over 2,000 years ago actually. The ram he identifies as the Medes and the Persians, this united kingdom, the two horns, the Medes and the Persians, and how they have come together and they've taken over the world here, become this world power. And then after them, this goat arises, and he says it is the Greeks, the Greek Empire, and that one horn, that first horn, this is fascinating to me, is the first leader of the Greeks. Now, if you've done any study in history, who would that be? Right, it's Alexander the Great. That's what this prophecy is prophesying about. Who it is talking about is Alexander the Great. It then says, and I again find this absolutely fascinating in this prophecy, that once this horn becomes great and powerful and taking over the world, then it's gone. And that is the history of Alexander the Great, who dies in his early 30s after conquering the known world and extending this massive empire. He then suddenly dies. His kingdom is then turned over to his generals to begin to reign, and it's divided up, and there's a power struggle amongst them. We're not going to go into that too much, but that's the idea of these four horns that come up, and then yet another horn that would come up. And this horn would rise up and be even more powerful than them. This other horn, many people believe that this is most likely fulfilled, at least partially, in Antiochus Epiphanes. And this would have been around 175 to 164 BC that he is fulfilling this small horn, this part of this vision that Daniel has. But I find it interesting here that Gabriel said that this vision is for the time of the end. For the time of the end. And so I think what we're seeing here is that very specifically the ram and the goat are representing specific kingdoms and people, but that there are elements of this vision, especially the part towards the end of it where it talks about these 2,300 days and the talking about the people of God being oppressed and being dominated by this ruthless leader, which Antiochus Epiphanes did do when he was ruling over the people of Israel and seeking to make them submit to him and to take upon his own gods and his own practices. But ultimately, of course, that would be resisted. But there's also an element of this that it seems like there is yet a future fulfillment. Yet a future fulfillment. And this is something that fascinates people who study the Bible when it comes to prophecy, because often in prophecy there is what they call a near and far fulfillment. A near and far fulfillment, in that the prophecy will be fulfilled in a way, partially, sort of, in a future or in a time that's very near to when the prophecy was given. Many times you see that. We can see that evidenced in Isaiah when it says, "Unto you a child is born." And now we understand that to be speaking of Christ, but also there was a near fulfillment in the day of Isaiah, speaking of a child who would be born, which would be his very own child. And it was a sign. And what it is it's showing that this prophecy will be fulfilled. It's being fulfilled now partially and in a sort of kind of way, but yet its future fulfillment is yet to come. It's actually a testimony of the truth of this prophecy. And we see this in the book of Daniel. We see this in many of these prophecies here. And one of the great things that it's happening here is it's reminding us the fact that God is in control, that Jesus is ultimately going to set up his kingdom. Daniel is sickened by this dream and this vision, it says, but he goes back to his duties and responsibilities, fulfilling what God's called him to do. Rely upon this fact that God is in control and in charge of all things. Hey, we're going to be in Daniel chapter 9 next time. I'll see you then. It's time.